Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, May 7th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization now representing 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story high-rise that fell suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds at 5:20 in the afternoon of 9/11. Before we go further, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Just to let everyone know, as I always do, that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which often occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You can submit them in the questions and information form, which is online at ae911truth.org. You just go up to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see a box right there. That's where you put your questions in. I'll also be looking at our YouTube broadcast of this webinar and the broadcast on our Facebook page to see any comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be covering today. And we may include them in the questions section of this presentation. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort that we're looking at today, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. Speaking of Building 7, did you even know about it? Most architects and engineers don't even know about the third worst structural failure in modern history. It should be the most discussed and inquired upon structural failure in all of our universities these days. And yet, sadly, we have to educate architects from the ground up at conferences with the American Institute of Architects and the American Society of Civil Engineers, structural engineering conferences, because our associations, our professional affiliations, the AIA, for instance, did not even issue one bulletin on this incredible structural failure, which we'll be talking about. 47 stories tall, easily the tallest building in most of our states. And the architect of record, Emery Roth and Sons, Erwin Cantor, was the structural engineer. And we have it being part of the World Trade Center complex, just outside the superblock known as the World Trade Center. Now, this building was not hit by an airplane. So it's a pure case study, if you will, in a failure at the World Trade Center. The third to collapse on 9/11, about 110 yards away from the North Tower. And at about 5:20, after witnesses hear explosions, which you will see, it collapses. And this is about 7 hours after the World Trade Center collapse. As you can see, it's standing just fine here, even though it was hit by a few beams from the World Trade Center. But NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, says that this was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. We'll show you what the cause of the collapse was in a moment. Let's look at the collapse itself. First, you see in the upper left, the east penthouse collapsing. And then 7 seconds later, 6.5, you see the overall building collapse, just like that. So that's what we're going to be focusing in on today. And you'll see this again. But let's go to Sham Sunder, the project leader of the NIST report, which came out 7 years after 9/11. Here's Sham Sunder.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, which fires are we talking about here? Normal office fires. These fires, which are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building, burning on various floors up to an hour and a half before the building collapses. Here on the east side, on the north side, they're on the east side of the north side, if you will. We'll come back to that because that's true at 2:30 and 3 o'clock. But even by 3 o'clock, as you can see here, these fires have moved on away from the area which NIST focuses on, which is here in the column 79 under the east penthouse, because it did collapse first. So that was their focus of study. And the problem is that fire is shown to have moved well past the east on to the west, to the right in this photograph here. And so NIST produces a fire simulation, which shows those fires at 2 p.m. or so burning on the south side, and they're moving over by 3 p.m. Over here, by 3 p.m. On the toward the east, and then toward the northeast by 4 p.m. And then they're shown to have remained around the column 79 for over an hour, even though, as you'll see, NIST acknowledges that fires don't persist in any 1 hour in a modern office building beyond 20 or 30 minutes. So we already have a problem here. And they acknowledge that is indeed the case. So we have a problem here again, because even by 3:50, those fires are shown to have moved to the west. So they're not burning in the area for more than an hour before the collapse of this building. Why is that important? That's important because NIST's theory, which is a thermal expansion of long-span steel beams, requires that fire to be burning at that time in that area. Instead, the photographs reveal that at 2 p.m., indeed, they're burning on the south side. 3 p.m., they begin to approach the north side. But again, by 4 p.m., contrary to NIST's fire simulation, those fires are burning, moving toward the west, which we show in our fire simulation here on the left, more consistent with the photographs. And by 5 p.m., they're burned out altogether on that floor. So they're not available to cause thermal expansion that NIST says is the cause of this collapse. Let's go back to Sham Sunder.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
So fire is the cause of this progressive collapse. We'll come back to the progressive part of this later.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Okay, let's go into this progression of collapse a little more detail. According to NIST, we have these long span steel beams, about 50 feet long, expanding because of the fire, which wasn't there for the hour before the collapse, but let's say it was. And let's say it could expand these beams. Well, it couldn't because these beams are fireproofed. And that's shown halfway through the installation of the fireproofing here in this drawing. But let's say they weren't fireproofed and they could have expanded. NIST is saying it pushed this girder off of its seat. Well, how could that have happened if that girder, in fact, had 30 shear studs tying it to the concrete slab up above? In other words, no way in hell could it have been pushed off of its seat. But let's say those shear studs weren't there, as NIST claims, and that girder did get pushed off of its seat. Well, it couldn't have been pushed off of its seat. Its seat being right here is a 12-inch seat that girder sits on. It would have had to have been pushed 12 inches off of its seat. Now, NIST says, well, that's not quite true because it only had to be pushed a little more than halfway off of its seat because this bottom flange would have folded. It couldn't bear all the weight of that girder. So it folded, and then after being pushed halfway off of its seat, the girder falls. Well, that couldn't have happened because on that, supporting that flange, this bottom flange here in the plan view, is a 3/4 inch stiffener. That stiffener is welded on there according to the Frankel shop drawings, which we show here. And in elevation, that stiffener is here. NIST omitted that stiffener because they claimed that it was only providing web crippling, but in fact it provided stiffening for the flange also. So that couldn't have happened. But let's say that could have all happened anyway through some set of miracles. This girder, they're saying, fell onto this floor, floor 12, below floor 13. And then that impact broke and caused a progressive collapse with floor 12 falling on floor 11 and 11 on 10 and so forth. And that's the progressive collapse until 9 floors when NIST is claiming that this entire collapse vertically allowed column 79 to be unbraced for 9 floors, and then that column buckles, and then that instability travels laterally through this building across this football field size building, 80 yards or so across the building. So that is quite problematic because we would have had massive deformation of the exterior structural steel system, causing massive breaking of granite panels and windows across the whole face of several faces of this building. So NIST has quite a problem here. Now, let's look at their model. Hold on one second. I'm going to make a note here, a really important note. Okay. Let's look at NIST's computer model here.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
They're showing 400 structural steel connections failing every second, as you see right now. And that's just impossible in a robust structure like you see, like we have here in this building, which was built in the late 80s. We also have the complete stopping of this. Well, let's look at it compared to the actual video now. Here's the video. They've got the building 7 modeled fairly well, but you would have seen massive breaking up of these granite panels and windows on the left side, certainly. And it stops after just 2 seconds. So why? Well, it begins to tip over. It does begin to show incredible exterior structural steel deformations in the computer model, which you'd expect, but that's not what the video shows at all of the actual collapse. So they're so far off from the video that you'll see why we sought to engage a university to do a separate and independent finite element analysis. Zooming in again, the east penthouse falls, but then for the entire 47 stories underneath it, you have a complete catastrophic failure, which is not reflected in the video. So we wrote a request, a Freedom of Information Act request for information. Let us see in this World Trade Center building, publicly problematic structural failure, right? The World Trade Center. We should be able to see the computer input data, but NIST refused to release it. It's a black box. You can't see it. We need structural engineers and architects need to see how you're modeling this. There's other similarly designed buildings throughout the world, many others. If there's a problem here due to fires, we need to know all about it, but they denied this, citing that it might jeopardize public safety. Well, doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the structural engineers and architects who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? Yeah, we think so. So we move on to the scientific method, and we use it in the West to winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. We have a question. How did the towers come down? In this case, Building 7. We do background research. How have other towers come down? Any by fire? We construct a hypothesis. It's our best guess as to how these towers might have come down, and we make predictions on those hypotheses, such as maybe fire did bring it down. Okay, let's look at controlled demolition also. That turns out to be a reasonable hypothesis, giving all the evidence for explosions and residue of explosives. We test those hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that's being done here in successive stages of inquiry. If we report those results in an open, transparent manner, we don't hide the computer input data, for instance, citing that it might jeopardize public safety if we were to release this information, as if a terrorist could use this information to plant explosives in another building or something. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis until the hypothesis is corroborated by the observations, the experiments, the results, and so forth. So let's do some background research in our effort following the scientific method today, looking at forces that do destroy buildings. For instance, fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic and chaotic process. It burns an area out in roughly 20 minutes in a modern office building. That's all the fuel there is. It moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So in a building that does collapse, not steel frame modern skyscrapers, they've never collapsed before 9/11, as we'll see, but say in a wood frame building, it'd fall over, not straight down through the cold, hard, intact structure below the fire. It's just not the way it works. How does it work in modern structural steel buildings? Well, in the UK, they built an 8-story building out of steel just to find out what would happen. and they lit it on fire. And they put all kinds of fuel in this building, as you'll see. Some of the steel members weren't even fireproofed. Now, all of the steel members in Building 7 were fireproof. Well, let's take a look.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. Here, fire protection engineer Jonathan Barnett is talking about 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. The report for this study shows that it's inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. And that's why we've never lost a skyscraper due to fire before 9/11. In fact, let's take a look at these.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
So no collapse. Let's put that on the shelf and just remember that fires don't bring down steel frame skyscrapers. And let's look at what might. These buildings certainly came down. In this case, earthquakes, and in these cases, concrete buildings. We certainly recognize the building after it's collapsed as a building. It's mangled, surely damaged. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. Keep that in mind. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. Keep that in mind as we look at Building 7 in some detail in a moment. These buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds with cauliflower shapes that are expanding rapidly due to the intense heat from the chemical reactions and hot gases from the explosive ignition. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. We have a solidly defined edge of this rapidly expanding cloud. If we have these features, we know a building's been blown up. It's not that difficult. Now, buildings are blown up very carefully in a scientific fashion, like you see here. To bring skyscrapers down, this is the method that we typically bring skyscrapers down with. It's called controlled demolition. We place thousands of shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building. and then set them off and synchronistically timed floor by floor so that the result is ordered and that the objectives are achieved. And there's a characteristic set of features that ensue with controlled demolitions. What are they? Well, we have a sudden onset of destruction in every case. It's not a natural collapse. Usually that occurs at the base of the structure, but not always. Feature number 2, a straight down symmetrical collapse occurs, usually into the building's own footprint, if that's what they're trying to achieve. And usually it's symmetrical, but not always. And feature number 3, this happens because there's a patterned removal of column supports. It's very clear and precise, and resulting in feature number 4, a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the structure, the thousands of tons of structure that was holding that building up, which is, of course, results in feature number 5, the total dismemberment of that structural steel or concrete frame, and resulting in feature number 5, limited damage to adjacent structures. At least that's the goal. So the more symmetrical you can get, the more control you have. Feature number 7, there's a patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. If you have those features, you know you have explosions. And feature number 8, the concrete is broken up, if not completely. They don't want to have to go back into the building and dismantle with jackhammers floors that are all odd angles. No, you let the explosives do that work. And remember that. Feature number 9, we have explosive charges visible at many floors. These are obviously squibs or isolated explosive ejections. Squibs is a term used in the controlled demolition industry. And of course, you have chemical evidence of explosive charges and devices left behind in the residue. If you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations and following the path of least resistance. With government documentation, that can be very helpful. You don't just get approvals to bring a building down in a day. It takes months. So there's foreknowledge. People know that the building's going to be coming down. Remember that. And experts agree, at least those experts that are not compromised with legal and financial obligations that might sway their objective opinion in a matter of whether a building has been brought down by controlled demolition or not. Remember that. Video documentation, all this, of course, can be proof of controlled demolition. Proof which we're going to be looking at today with regard to Building 7. We're going to apply this proof. Let's get started. Is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Well, let's listen to Dan Rather and watch the buildings collapse once again.
Shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? What are we talking about here? Dan's using his intuition, of course. He's seen the old hotels in Las Vegas like you've seen on TV. The problem is he's never said this on TV after 9/11. In fact, we've never seen, except for 2 or 3 occasions, Building 7 coming down. So it it's quite a problem. I mean, people don't know about it. It's an unknown, not just architects and engineers, but many, 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 many others. It's been wiped from history, but not any longer. Feature number 2, straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. Let's look. It's from West Street. Is it straight down symmetrical? Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. That is very difficult to achieve. How do we achieve this? Before we figure that out, look at the penthouse structure. A second before the overall building comes down, the penthouse drops a half a second prior. What does that mean? Well, that means the structure underneath the screen wall and west penthouse here have been taken out so that the whole penthouse comes down. Well, wait a minute. The official story from NIST tells us that the east penthouse, which collapses first, and then across this football field size building, 70 or 80 yards, the instability travels laterally in about 10 seconds. But that's completely disproven by what you're seeing right here. The core of the building is compromised all at once, enabling the screen wall and west penthouse remaining after the east penthouse collapsed to fall all at once. And it falls into its own footprint, indicating symmetricality. The center of this pile is in the center of the footprint. Let's compare on the left, building 7, on the right, a series of controlled demolitions. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper in history before 9/11? Should it not have been the first hypothesis that NIST came up with, instead of the relegated to a series of frequently asked questions, very frequently, by NIST, which were only published on their website years later? And so we're led to believe that these fires brought this building down symmetrically. How do you bring a building down symmetrically? You have to take out all the columns at once. Otherwise, the building will begin to tip over if there's any lack of precision in the removal of those columns. Does fire have that level of precision? These fires? Consider this carefully, because the implications are grave, as you can imagine. How fast is the building coming down? Feature number 4. Let's go to David Chandler, physics teacher.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to freefall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
The building fell through its own structure with zero resistance?
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
This is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah, and NIST admits, after having been publicly embarrassed in a press conference by members of AE 9/11 Truth, having denied that the building came down in free fall, they come back in their final report in 2008 and admit that 8 stories or 100 feet or a third of this building's 7-second collapse occurred at free fall. But they don't acknowledge the implications of a free falling building, which they had actually stated before. Well, if it was in free fall, that means there'd be no structure underneath it, right? Where did the structure go? So we go on to feature number 5. Is there a total dismemberment of the structural steel system? Yeah, a 47-story skyscraper collapses to about 6 stories. That means that all the columns and the beams where they're welded very thoroughly so that they don't just bend. This is a moment-resisting structural steel frame building. And yet it completely collapses like a house of cards. Remember, buildings that fall due to natural causes don't collapse like a house of cards. Their columns and beams are not severed one from another. Is there limited damage to adjacent structures? Yes, fairly limited damage. The building is in the center. The pile is in the center of the footprint. Feature number 7, are there sounds of explosions heard and seen by witnesses? Let's first go to Sham Sunder on this issue.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
Well, let's listen to some of these witnesses. Here is Daryl, a medical student or business student on radio that afternoon.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
A shock wave ripping through the building, a sound of a clap of thunder, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. Not the building coming down causing that. How about Kevin Mcladden, former Air Force medic?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Okay, it's getting interesting. How about this gentleman?
I'm going to call in Bill Rizzotti. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
Well, this is very helpful testimony. How about this gentleman who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, went into the building after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down, the Twin Towers. They hadn't realized that the building had been evacuated, and they're trying to make their way up to the 23rd floor. This is their experience.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then when we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run. Well,
information of bombs, like those that were, or that which was heard by these first responders in the vicinity of Building 7 in the late morning of 9/11?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
We're told that any such sounds were the sounds of one floor falling on another, and then another, and then another. None of these witnesses of explosions appear in the draft or final reports by NIST. But here's another witness that does, and we'll talk about how. Because there were seismic waves that were picked up by the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory 20 miles north in Palisades, New York. And they say, oh, this is, NIST claims this is the sound of the building collapsing. Let's look at this very carefully, though, because the seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds, but the building doesn't even begin to collapse until more than 10 seconds later. So how can the building collapse cause those seismic signals? Well, NIST has an explanation for this. The seismic signal approximately 10 seconds prior to the onset of the collapse was likely due to the falling of debris from the inside of the building. Well, wait a minute. They're saying, in their theory, that the building collapsed on the inside first, and then the exterior collapsed. But what we already saw was that the main penthouse and screen wall, the west penthouse and screen wall, collapsed only half a second prior, indicating a complete core column collapse simultaneously, occurring just a half a second prior to the overall collapse, as we see right here. So that completely pulls the rug out from underneath NIST's theory that the interior collapsed 10 seconds prior. I'll make a note of that. And fortunately, we have some objective scientists out there. Andre Rousseau, for instance, applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology. He does his analysis. He says, okay, well, the peak seismic signal occurs here. NIST claims here. 10 seconds later, and he says the seismic data indicates that the bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the fall of debris. The total mass and average mass of individual building fragments were relatively small and fell to the ground over a period of more than 10 seconds, a very long time. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. So these undeniably have an explosive origin. He's an expert. He ought to know. What else do we find here? Because in feature number 8 is the incredibly pulverized material here. Well, the National Fire Protection Guide 921. It says, look for that. And this is the Fire and Explosion Investigation Authority, used throughout this country and around the world to a large extent. Large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, as we see racing away from Building 7's collapse in every direction, expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes of extremely hot gases at 35 miles an hour racing down these streets. So what's producing this incredible heat expansion? Not these fires, which were surely put out upon the collapse, by the collapse. Something more in the order of this order of magnitude. So let's look for what could be causing that. As we examine the site itself and find surface temperatures by the NASA airplane, infrared sensitive cameras, thermal imaging, 1,340 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface of the pile of Building 7. Now, wait a minute. There's no fire on the surface of the pile of Building 7. So what are we measuring? Well, we must be measuring something that is deep down in the pile, much hotter, that radiates above, and by the time it gets to that heat gets to the surface of the pile, is measured at 1,340 degrees. That's hotter than most office fires ever get to. So what's the source of that heat? Abelhausen Astani Azel had access to the Fresh Kills landfill site where they were taking this steel. What does he say?
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
Saw the melting of girders. Now, girders don't melt at 1,340 degrees, much less 500 or 600 degrees, which is more typical of office fires. And he documents that girder from Building 7 as having been melted. It takes 2,800 degrees to melt steel, not 500 or 600 degrees. So what's melting the steel? What is Jonathan Barnett, FEMA author, says? Steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, it takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. And that's what you're seeing here in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Fascinating. So the New York Times says, documents this very carefully, and they point to Appendix C in the FEMA report, which was issued in May of 2002, the Building Performance Assessment Report. In this metallurgical examination, these scientists cite never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, solid steel girders turning into Swiss cheese. This doesn't happen in office fires. And remember, no plane hit this building, no jet fuel. Jet fuel is just kerosene anyway. It only burns at 600 degrees in open air, according to its manufacturers. But there's no jet fuel here. What's turning these beams into Swiss cheese? Rapid oxidation and sulfidation, these scientists cite. Liquid iron, that's molten iron, 2,800 degrees to begin to melt iron. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Yet this information is completely eliminated from the NIST report when NIST came in and took over the investigation from FEMA in 2002 and created their own report 5 years later. What do they say? Well, gosh, we couldn't test it. I don't know why they didn't use the same steel FEMA did, but they said no steel was recovered from Building 7. I Again and again and again and again, they make these claims. So, and yet their co-project leader, John Gross, is seen standing on the pile, documenting the very piece of steel that was cut off and provided to FEMA, in which they documented the hot sulfur corrosion attack in silver dollar size holes. He denies it, and yet his evidence, his shadow is all over this evidence. Well, the fires are maybe 1,200 degrees, according to one supporter of the official story, but steel doesn't melt until 2,750 or 2,800 degrees. It doesn't begin to melt. So what could be responsible for that? Well, we'll be looking at some options here. But desks and chairs and even jet fuel, as I mentioned, only burn 600 to 1,400 degrees. It's a problem. You can tell, though, by the color of this material pouring out of the stuff held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator, what its temperature is. We're talking 2,500 degrees here. That's just the physics of molten metals. You can tell how hot they are. Okay, well, what caused this steel to melt then? Let's get into it. Is there evidence of thermite incendiaries? Because that's one possibility, right? We lay out all the possibilities without regard to our own financial or political preconditionings, or that might sway our objective opinion. Could thermite have produced this? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the extreme heat it produces, 4,000 degree temperatures. And what? The elemental iron. So it would explain the abundant elemental iron, which we're going to see all over the place momentarily. It would also explain, not steel, by the way. Steel's used, iron is used in steel, but we're talking elemental iron here, as you'll see. They also explain the presence of sulfur. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. In fact, the National Fire Protection Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. Now, NIST claims they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But later, in writing, they say NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residues. You can't find what you won't test for. Others did, though. It wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones, physicist, nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, looked for that evidence. In fact, it was sent to him by several sculptors, this one at the International Peace Park, who sent him a piece of slag from this sculpture. He does some analysis. First, he notices, gosh, this is an irregular pattern. This isn't the kind of cutting they do at the site by the iron workers who use extremely effective cutting torches like oxyacetylene and thermal lances, which produce cuts like this. not like that or that. So more importantly, the X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis shows from the slag residue that we have iron and aluminum, which shouldn't be there, but more importantly, even manganese, sulfur on the ends of these beams. Where does this come from? This is not from the iron workers. And interestingly, also, the U.S. Geological Survey, in their particle atlas of the study of all of this dust, these samples from 2005, the analysis on all of them shows these previously molten iron microspheres. Well, how did they get molten? And that indicates 2,800 degrees again. How did they get to be iron? We haven't used iron in skyscrapers in 100 years. This is not steel. And this is fascinating because we're talking about, in some cases, up to 6% of these samples. This amounts to up to 4 tons of these previously molten iron microspheres. Compared to the background quantities and shapes of iron particles which can occur in dust, as you see here. These are spherical. Well, how do they get spherical? R.J. Lee Group, an environmental consulting firm who's also doing studies of the dust, finds that these were formed during the event, not before by the construction workers or in the concrete in the form of fly ash, not after by the iron workers cleaning up the site, but during the event. They're so ubiquitous that they're termed a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these previously molten iron microspheres. And yet they have no idea where they came from. They don't even speculate. Well, let's look at a controlled experiment here with thermite. Slowing it down halfway, it produces thousands, look like sparks, but these are spherical objects. And they turn out to be iron. So they're molten iron spheres from a controlled experiment with thermite. How do they get to be spherical? Well, aerosolized liquid under pressure disperses and the surface tension forms it into spheres. That's what raindrops do, for instance, or out of a spray bottle when you're cleaning your windows. Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the top of these cars in this very high heat event? What other rational explanation is there than falling liquid molten iron droplets? Well, you can make molten cutter charges in your own backyard, shaped cutter charges, like you see on the left here. You have to hold the thermite against the steel in order for it to cut through, like you see here. In this backyard experiment by civil engineer John Cole, and they can cut cleanly through these beams. But there are much more effective devices that do this. They were patented prior to 9/11. In fact, here in this patent, it projects thermite streams of molten iron on the order of hundreds of milliseconds, much more effective at cutting through much thicker sections of structural steel like you have in this incredibly strong skyscraper building 7, 4-inch thick slabs of steel down at the bottom. Normal controlled demolitions like high energy explosives like C4 or RDX won't cut through that thick of steel. Plus, you'd have much louder bangs and brighter flashes, audio and visual signatures that you would not want in a deceptive, controlled demolition like we have at Building 7. And there are devices whose casings themselves are made out of consolidated, consumable thermite. So there's nothing left behind except pools of molten iron, which are seen all over the place by witnesses, which we'll get to in next week's series, or actually 2 weeks from today. In part 2 and 3 of we go into the Twin Towers. So, but what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? I'm telling you, this evidence goes on and on and on, because a team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen test 7 samples and document 4 of these in their peer-reviewed paper. Samples like from the apartment of Jeanette McKinley, who lived across the street from the South Tower on Liberty Street. And her windows were blown in by the incredible explosive force. And her apartment filled with this dust. She saved it and later gave a sample to Stephen Jones. She used it in her art projects as a form of healing from this traumatic experience. She paid for that decision with her life, unfortunately. She succumbed to brain cancer very, very tragically. But her sample is one of these 4. They're red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, indicating they were applied in a fluid fashion like paint. They thought they were paint, but they're attracted to a magnet. Now, there's up to 10 tons of this material, unignited material, found in the World Trade Center dust. So they get real curious and do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the red layer and find what? Aluminum and elemental iron. This is not supposed to be in the World Trade Center dust. This is not paint. In addition, oxygen, silica, carbon. So what's that doing there? They get real curious, zoom into this red layer 50,000 times and find what? Rhomboidally shaped iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is extremely sophisticated material, and it's set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. What does that mean? Organic material is what's added to TNT to produce the gas expansion that we see in high energy explosives. So here we have an incendiary that appears to be engineered to become more explosive. In fact, at about 758 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit, we have ignition when you put this in a heater. It ignites, producing much more energy than it has, indicating that it's a active thermitic material. In fact, when it ignites, it produces what? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature that we see from the molten iron microspheres that are found in the World Trade Center dust by so many others. So you see, we know where these molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips, as if we didn't know, because they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips throughout the dust, as you see here and here. So you see, we have an internally consistent set of repeatable experimental data that can be used in a court of law as evidence to bring the perpetrators, i.e., in this case, the suppliers of this material, to justice. You see, when you get these particles down to the nanoscale, the surface volume increases exponentially. So the chemical reaction is almost instantaneous. So you've, again, engineered something that's an incendiary to become much more explosive. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced, sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories. The 25-page peer-reviewed paper concludes that the red layer of these red-gray chips is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material, not paint. Okay? So altogether, these 10 characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition point to destruction with explosives, not by fire. Fire doesn't create any of these characteristics, let alone all of them, which we've seen today. Well, why couldn't the fires have brought this building down just in terms of fire protection technology itself? Steel conducts the heat away. That's one reason buildings don't collapse due to fires, and structural steel, high-rise buildings, fire protected. That conduction keeps the source of that heat from ever becoming a problem, or from the steel reaching its 1200 degree critical temperature at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. To keep that from becoming a problem, we go ahead and protect it with fireproofing anyway, cementitious fireproofing. 2 or 3 hour protection. That's 6 times the fire protection that you need, because fire only lasts in an office skyscraper for 20 or 30 minutes anyway, even as acknowledged by NIST. So you have incredible redundant protection from the fire. And then, of course, we keep these buildings from being built out of combustible materials. We keep the tenants from bringing in significant fuel loads. And then we sprinkler these buildings to keep them from ever becoming a problem. In the case of Building 7, the sprinklers were said to have been, the water mains feeding the sprinklers were said to have been compromised by the collapse of the Twin Towers. But we still have a number of hurdles to, as you can see, clear. With additional circumstantial and corroborative testimony, like the FEMA report, let's just look at it for a moment. They had $600,000, but their efforts were quite hampered because they couldn't get access to the blueprints of the building. They couldn't get access to because of bureaucratic restrictions, getting access to the site, an appeal to the public for photographs and videos and so forth. So that was documented in the New York Times. In 2008, NIST takes over the investigation, throws out the Appendix C metallurgical examination, and throws in all kinds of obfuscation, starting with the stated conclusion with the fire, that fires caused the collapse. This was not an open-ended investigation. They knew what their conclusion was before they started their investigation. That is not how you work with the scientific method. And they even acknowledge all the way through, or in 2006, truthfully, we've had a trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Indeed, they did. So they say, FEMA does, early on, further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue of how this building came down. So unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve this issue, we have a major problem here. And easily the 3 largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads a day of steel being carted away, starting just 2 weeks after the collapse. Put on these barges, sent to China, for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately, but it didn't and doesn't, prompting so many experts. Over 100 structural engineers, for instance, signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth. And in this case, one of the top controlled demolition experts in the world to cry out that
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten, zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Wow, we have not heard that on mainstream media, nor this from Hugo Bachmann, Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering, PhD. In my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. And one of the structural engineers I mentioned, 100 of them, calling for a new investigation. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Which is also why we have hired the University of Alaska, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Halsey, to engage in a 4-year study to determine what could have caused, or if, first of all, if fire causes buildings collapse. He does lots of study here, and this report is now out. He says no other tall steel frame buildings ever failed due to fire. And we need to ensure that public safety and that the failure mechanism for the structure be understood. So he examines the response to fire loads. That's his first approach. Second, he rules out scenarios that would not cause the collapse. And third, he tries to identify the failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. Okay, well, he uses the same values and input data that NIST does, as much of it as we can get from NIST, given that they denied their input data. But it's easy enough to show. But what does he find? One, he simulates the local structural response to fire loading for floors 13 and below. Two, he examines the NIST collapse initiation hypothesis in detail. And then three, simulates the numerous failure scenarios within the structural frame, overall structural framing, identify what could lead to the total collapse observed on 9/11. So this analysis is extremely detailed. He uses 3 different software programs to balance against each other and corroborate each other. In the area of NIST's collapse theory, the northeast section here, remember the thermal expansion of these beams causing this girder to be pushed off its seat on this column 79, and then a progressive collapse ensues. So he finds a number of problems here, some of which we've already spoken of. But here's the conclusions, the key conclusions. That NIST overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. They made it infinitely strong, forcing that girder to be pushed off toward the east. They found that the exterior walls were actually flexible, so the girder would have actually moved, if it could have moved at all, the other direction. And then he found that NIST's erroneous assumptions that shear connections on several beams were broken, that wouldn't have happened, and that the bolts fastening girder, this we call them shear studs, A2001 to its seat were broken. This was invalid as well. Excuse me, I'm mistaking. These are the bolts fastening the girder to the seats. They're not shear studs. So he finds that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail in their FEA analysis. And if they could have led to failure, the building would have tipped over, like you see here. So ultimately, they forced them to fail in the analysis. And sure enough, like you'd expect, asymmetrical loading on the building produces asymmetrical collapse. They also found the collapse of Building 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving sequential failure of columns, but a global failure, which when they put it together, they find that it collapses like you see here. And so their conclusions are that the fire did not cause the collapse. The temperature was not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. The thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. And Building 7 didn't experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns over an 8-story height or 100 feet. So that when you actually run the FEA computer modeling, oh, come on. Interesting. You find that NIST's computer model on the right, as you already saw, looks nothing like the video collapse, but the global collapse modeled by the University of Alaska looks exactly like the actual collapse of the building. And we'll fix that video. So how about foreknowledge? If this building was set up to fail, people would know about it, right? Well, let's look at this interesting problem with the fire chief asking an engineer, if we allowed it to burn, how soon could we anticipate a collapse? Well, this anonymous engineer says, oh, about 5 hours. Never before has a fire brought down a skyscraper. And so the first time in history, this engineer is saying 5 hours. Guess what? It collapsed in 5 hours. He was right on the money. This prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge. Of course, that fire wasn't anywhere near the area of the column 79 under the east penthouse. They won't release the name of this engineer. Completely anonymous. More interestingly, these construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion in Building 7, looking back over their shoulder at Building 7, then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building as we coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. Flame, debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. How do they know the building is about to blow up? It had a few small fires. How about Kevin Mcladden, who earlier we heard as witnesses of explosions. Now we're hearing what happened before that. He's held back about 6 blocks from Building 7 along with everybody else behind the yellow tape because they're saying that the building had structural damage, that it could come down. Well, this is what he's listening to, a radio held in the hands of, interestingly enough, a Red Cross worker, and here's what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here? What other foreknowledge is there? Oh, the BBC announces the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it even happened.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. An unprecedented event yet again that's announced by the BBC 23 minutes before it happened. And here's CNN, who announces it many hours before it even happened. Let's listen to Alan Dodds-Frank.
In New York, Alan Dodds-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Saga and others have...
A forest fire roaring down a canyon filled with smoke. 50 stories went down. No other 50-story building went down. No other building went down. There were a few buildings that of far lesser height that were damaged when the Twin Towers came down. What if this building was intended to go down at that time at 10:45? Well, the site would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud released when the Twin Towers went down. We wouldn't have videos of Building 7's collapse. So some 9/11 researchers suggest that this building indeed wasn't supposed to go down at that time, but was a dud, and that those construction workers walking back into the building went back into the building, and then they're seen coming out of the building when they heard the explosions that you just heard. Well, how about the owner of this building? What does he say a year later on PBS, America Rebuilds program, referring to Building 7 here?
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
They made the decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. Pulling a building is a demolition term. Firefighters don't pull buildings. They don't make those decisions either. Larry says, oh, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. But you don't refer to firefighters as it. And firefighters weren't fighting the fire in the building. They were told not to fight the fire early on. So there were no firefighting operations taken. Well, in today's use of the scientific method, the question we leave you with is, what brought the building down? What's the most scientifically provable hypotheses? Fire or controlled demolition? We believe we've shown 10 key characteristic and many uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition here, destruction with explosives. That fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, we believe that this is proof of the destruction, explosive destruction of Building 7 today. And we leave that with you and encourage you to ask your questions of us. Andy, how can they do that? Because we can answer some questions, can't we?
Absolutely. So submit your questions right now in the same input form we were talking about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org, and go under continuing education and find the live webinars. There's a box right there. But in the meantime, we'll tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Awesome. And you can do that right here, as Andy mentioned. And subscribe while you're on the website to our newsletter. We send out every once in a while the latest evidence that we've got, and we want you to be aware of it. The latest efforts we're getting toward a real investigation and the projects we have in order to do that. So that takes approximately 1 minute, and you can do it real quick. You can get informed if you have more time. On our website, we have a complete evidence section with a whole lot more evidence we've been able to bring to you in this first part of this 3-part series. Sign the petition while you're there. You can be one of 20,000 others supporting the 3,000 architects and engineers who are signed on to the petition. If you're an architect or engineer, we encourage you to sign on as an architect or engineer. And take your stand publicly. This is extremely important. The implications of the controlled demolition of Building 7 are grave. It causes all kinds of questions. It's obviously part of the conspiracy, if you will, that was underway in this terrorist attack. The question is, who are the terrorists here? If this is a controlled demolition, we got to get to the bottom of this question. And many researchers have assisted us in going other routes. We look at the World Trade Center evidence, as you've seen today, and we get this out to architects and engineers all over the country, and this takes effort on our part. We have 6 employees who are full-time working for you. So this takes an effort with all the projects that we have. We need your support. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And so become a member of AE 911 Truth. Join the family of sustaining supporters with your monthly donation. Highly encouraged. And if you can't do that, then please volunteer with us. We have dozens and dozens of opportunities for you. Andy, what are some of those opportunities?
That's right. And now more than ever, we need to have people out there on the forefront. We have the release of the Building 7 report, and we need people to see it. And there's different ways that you can help. And the great thing is it's a shared responsibility among many different volunteers. So just a little bit of work, maybe each night for an hour or 2 here and there, can really go a long way. You can find information on who to contact. You can actually reach out and call them once some of these folks get back to work. We have congressional outreach going on. We have translations team, which is a very important team for reaching out beyond our borders here. So many different opportunities and things that you can do. But the first step is to go to ae911truth.org. You'll see there's a volunteer form on there. It's very short, very easy to fill out. We'll get in touch with you and figure out where you will best fit. And typically, I think people best fit where they want to fit and the kind of stuff they like to do. So if you got talents and you've got time and energy, please donate them to this important cause.
Perfect. And there's things you can do on your own also, guys. Talk to your elected representatives. Bring them the information we're talking about. You can take it to your television, radio, newspapers. Send the ae911truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find and everybody that you know. Screen the DVDs to your friends, family, colleagues, professionals. Share the brochures that are available on our site for 100 of them for $10 and pass them out. They're great conversation starters and finishers. They really help you out. Don't do this on your own. Use the architects and engineers for 911 Truth. Use the WTC evaluation that was done by Professor Leroy Hulsey. The final report is out, and you can download it on our website and send it to building professionals. You can give it to your local elected representatives, and Andy will show you how here.
That's right. What you're looking at here is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who tragically lost his life on the morning of September 11th. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower lobby. But we don't hear anything about explosions in the North Tower lobby as being the one of the factors that contributed to this building's fail. So right now, just by naming it after him, we have an instant conversation starter with your congressman as to why this official story doesn't make any sense. His father, Bob McIlvaine, has worked with us for years, been tirelessly crusading for a new investigation. And what this would do is exactly what we've been asking Congress to do for as long as AE 9/11 Truth has existed. It is a new investigation already written up for him, draft legislation. It could be passed in either house of Congress, would create a select committee to look into this evidence, not just take a bunch of data from NIST that hasn't been verified and rubber stamp an official story, but to look into what Richard has talked about today. It's actually written in the legislation. So how can you get involved? Well, the first step is to go to ae911truth.org/justice. Familiarize yourself with the act, with the issue. There's a packet you can download. It's got a letter from Richard and a letter from Bob McIlvaine and the act itself. When your congressmen are out in public again, you can go up to them and hand it to put it right into their hands. You can write to them. Just put your address in the box that's provided there. It'll generate a letter that'll automatically go to them from you. You can also get involved with our current congressional outreach by contacting us or just write to your congressman. And there's an article right on our site that tells you how to do this and request a meeting. Richard, Roland, Engel, Ted Walter, our director of strategy, will sit on the phone with you in a phone meeting and your congressman or their staffer and go over these points and talk about the Halsey report as well. So there's a number of ways that you can get involved, and we make them available to you. But when this gets passed, it's going to be the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. So get behind it and do whatever you can to let your congressman know this issue is not going away and they need to get behind this.
Thanks, Sandy. And guess what? We have submitted to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan a petition with 60 exhibits, which includes the evidence you've seen here today and much more. And they have written back stating that they will comply with the law. And we have submitted a mandamus action requiring them to prove to us that they've done that. So that's pending that legal action. In other legal action, we have the FBI being sued by us. And the problem here is that we've given them our evidence over the years. They have not provided it to Congress, which Congress tasked them to do in the 2015 congressional review. 9/11 congressional review. And so we're suing them, and we're in an appeal process at that point. So stand by for exciting results, because that becomes public when it goes to. It's already public. You're looking at it here today, but it gains a whole lot of attraction when Congress is handed additional evidence on an official basis by the FBI. And now you know why the 5 New York area town fire commissioners have unanimously voted for a resolution demanding a new investigation based on this same evidence and supporting that the actual grand jury investigation that we just mentioned. So he says, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force, Christopher Joya says. So very exciting news there on that part. And equally exciting is the landmark documentary we made that we need to put into your hands. And it's on YouTube now, the 1-hour version. So 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out is the documentary with 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence in a unique fashion that's captivating. And I encourage you to take a look here, a couple of minutes, then we'll get to your questions.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them that can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can watch this video free on YouTube, the 1 hour version, or get the 1.5 hour version on our store. And along with 40 experts with additional in-depth interviews, it's a great way to learn all about this, as is the 50-page booklet you can download for free, the PDF, beyondmisinformation.org, or buy the fancy version in our store. This presentation today in the 2 hour version is available on the DVD, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth. And there's just a 15-minute version, which covers Building 7. We made it for PBS. And it aired in its 5-minute version. But this 15-minute version is even better. It's narrated by Ed Asner, and it's free on YouTube, Solving the Mystery of World Trade Center 7. With that out of the way, Andy, what kind of questions do we have for today?
Well, we have some very good questions, as always. The first one begins, correct me if I'm wrong, but NIST tried to tell us how the fire made the girder fall off of column 79. So is it the data of what happens after this event that NIST is hiding due to jeopardizing public safety?
Well, NIST modeled, it did a computer model, and computer models have input data. And how strong are the beams? How hot is the fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's holding the girder back from being pushed? All that input data is critical, because you in a finite element analysis or any computer modeling, if you have garbage in, you get garbage out. So naturally, we want to see what NIST put into the computer model, and some of it they reveal, and some of it they won't. Why would they hide any of it? There's no reason to hide it unless you're trying to hide something. Again, there are similarly designed buildings throughout the world. The architects and engineers are the ones that need to have this input data so that we can verify the results of NIST's claim that this building came down due to fire. So, Andy, do you think that answers the question? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's stuff that obviously our researchers would want, because we want to see how they manipulated that data to come to their conclusions, because their conclusions don't compound with what you see on video and the laws of physics and reality. I mean, with computers, you can make anything happen. You can make people fly around a fantasy world and whatnot. So no doubt, because NIST had a predetermined conclusion, they did something there where they tried to make their model come to that conclusion. But of course, even their model begins to throw into doubt their theory, because it doesn't do the same thing that we saw in real life. It begins to twist around. So obviously they're hiding something, and this is the fact. And no, I don't really have much else to say about that. So
and also, some of that data happens before the fire, i.e. the structure of the building itself. But then there's a fire. And so that's during the event itself. And then, yes, even after the initiation of collapse, I think that would be output data more than input data. So if that was the intent of the question, it's both during the event and before that we're looking for the input data.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is they're hiding something.
Yeah.
The next question asks, do you know when to start looking for the PBS infomercials regarding the new study from Alaska on Building 7?
I don't. I expect a week or so. Do you have more specific information, Andy?
I don't. I know they are working on it. I know they're editing it, and I don't have a specific time, but we will certainly let our supporters know when it comes out, because we want you all to watch it, of course. And, so we will send out a bulletin or something, but you will definitely know about it. And certainly even afterwards, we're going to talk a lot about it and how it was on there. So don't worry.
It's coming.
In a NIST video about why Building 7 fell, the narrator says the fires lasted for 7 hours without mentioning how a fire looks for new fuel sources. In general, would many viewers think that the fire lasted for 7 hours in one place when this is how NIST describes the scene?
Well, yes. I think NIST's description, in addition to their computer modeling, is fraudulent. They admitted early on in their report that fire only can last for 20 to 30 minutes. I mean, what's there to burn? You got desks, carpet, chairs, 20 minutes in a given area. A room, an office. And then the fire has to move on. So that's a very generalized statement, of course, but NIST made it themselves. And so the fires are not going to last for a couple of hours, as their fire simulation shows in the area of column 79. it's going to move on, just like the photographs show that it did, in this case to the west, leaving that area to cool. So how can beams expand after the fire's gone? Because it's an expansion process that pushes the gritter off of its seat, according to their initiation of collapse theory, that allows the 13th floor to fall on the 12th and so on. That didn't happen an hour before the collapse. I mean, that's not their claim, and there's no collapse before the collapse. The collapse happens at 5:23. So what's happening at 5:23? The fire's been gone for an hour. There's no thermal expansion. There's no collapse. There's so many elements. We've looked at probably 24 elements that keeps today alone, that keeps NIST's initiation of collapse theory from ever happening.
Our next question asks, Barry Jennings says the word explosion a dozen times and the word boom only once. In the frequently asked questions, NIST does not mention that a witness heard explosions and only mentions that the witness heard a boom. Doesn't it sound like NIST cherry picks over and over of what they are telling the public?
Well, they certainly do. They didn't tell him anything about thermite. They didn't tell him anything about previously molten iron microspheres. They didn't tell him anything about nanothermite or thermate, which we've seen evidence for at the World Trade Center here today. So in terms of NIST cherry picking the boom versus the explosions, why NIST would choose one characterization of a witness of explosions versus the other, I'm not sure why, of course, and I'm also not sure what the questioner is getting to with regard to that distinction. Do you have any idea, Andy?
Well, to compare it to what Graham McQueen did when he went through the oral histories and found 118 accounts of explosions, and he was very conservative in how he did it. He looked for people who distinctly said explosion instead of words like boom or pop or anything like that, because that can be very generalized. NIST zeroed in on boom, and they totally disregard the fact that Barry Jennings clearly said an explosion. But they weren't interested in the 118 oral histories either, or the 118 accounts from the oral histories either. Again, I think NIST just came up with a predetermined conclusion, and they had some questions to deal with from people like Richard and the other researchers, and they wanted to put something out there to say that we addressed it and then not revisit it. So to them, that's a good enough explanation. But for anybody that actually researches and thinks about this to any deep level, obviously it's not. All right, our last question is really an interesting comment here from YouTube, and somebody wrote, any young people in school, this should be your science fair project. And I will tell you what, that is the best idea. I think you'd be the coolest kid in school if you did this, especially if it's a voluntary extracurricular thing. Your grade's not involved. Go ahead and do it. What's the worst that can happen to you? You're not going to get some ribbon from the school that you're going to end up throwing away when you clean out your room later at 18. I think being able to share some of this information and coming up with some kind of cool project that demonstrates exactly what Richard's talking about, maybe have a little laptop with ESO playing for people to look at, would be the greatest thing. And if any kids actually go out there and do that, let us know, and we'll feature it somehow.
Yeah, and there's some science projects we'll be looking at 1 week from today that you can do or show your kids they can do it. They involve the free fall collapse of World Trade Center, or near free fall collapse of World Trade Center 1 and 2, particularly the North Tower, WTC 1. You can, it involves taking a block, and on the left hand, you have this block representing, I got it. Hold on a second. I'll show you. Here we go. So we have a block, And this is the North Tower section, 15 stories. And this is the North Tower section underneath the point of jet plane impacts. You know, try holding a block over this building in one hand and then in the other over nothing at all, and drop them both at once and see which one hits the ground first. This is kindergarten physics, right? Obviously, if there's any resistance, that object is going to slow down. Well, NIST acknowledges that the building came down essentially at free fall, but they don't acknowledge how that could have happened in the case of the Twin Towers either. So we'll come back and see us at 1 o'clock next weekend, because next week on Thursday, when we get to that section. And here we go. Because today we're focused on building 7, but next week we go right into the Twin Towers explosive destruction. We look at the evidence of explosions, the witnesses of explosions, dozens and dozens and dozens of them. We have a sudden near free fall collapse, high velocity lateral ejections, shattering of the structural steel frame from top to bottom, the midair pulverization of concrete. And then we get into the detailed analysis of the heat in the towers the next week. So every Thursday, the first 3 Thursdays of each month, anyway, we have this 3-part series going on. So, that's it for today. I want to thank Andy and all you guys for joining us. I really appreciate it. Until we get back together next week, you take care and bye for now.